It's a four-step process on how to respond to triggering situations in an intentional way rather than a reactionary way. You're having an argument over perhaps taking medication, anything that kind of gets you riled up. You and your loved one just aren't communicating. And so there are four pieces: catch, calm, challenge, and choose compassion.
That's the voice of DeAnne Sherman, a mental illness advocate and educator, who's with us on this episode with her daughter, clinical psychologist Dr. Michelle Sherman, to talk about when you love someone with a mental illness, what are skills that will give you hope and strength on your journey? And the 4 C's are just the beginning. Welcome to our podcast, Schizophrenia, 3 Moms in the Trenches. From the place where schizophrenia and real life collide. East Coast, West Coast, Middle America. With Miriam Feldman, Mindy Greiling, and Randy Kay. This is February 25th, and this is episode, I think, 113 of Schizophrenia, 3 Moms in the Trenches. Welcome. I'm Randy Kay, here with Mimi Feldman and Mindy Greiling. If you're new to us, we're 3 moms. We've each written a book about our experiences with our sons. Each of our sons has schizophrenia, and we are turning pain to purpose by having this podcast to help other people. So welcome. Tonight's episode, we're going to be talking with a mother-daughter team who have the same purpose. And they have written a couple of books, and one is brand new, about loving someone with mental illness. And they're going to give us skills, hope, and strength. But before I bring them in, let's just do a quick update all around. I'm Randy Kay, and I will just start very, very briefly. If you've been listening, you know that my son, who I call Ben for publicity purposes, has been having a really rough time in the last year or so with incarceration and substance use. And I will say that at the moment, he's in a sober home, which is really good news. Whether or not it's going to work out for any more than the day, I don't know, but that's what it is when you love somebody with substance problems as well as serious mental illness. But at the moment, he's safe. He seems happy. He's refusing medication. And this is a zero tolerance house. So I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but I've learned to live in the hope when you get it. So that's what's going on with me. Mindy?
Jim, as you know, has been accepted to the most wonderful supportive housing in Minnesota, if not the country. And the only news is it's taking a heck of a long time to fill out all the paperwork. They told us be ready to move within 2 weeks, and that time has passed, and they're still going along with the paperwork. And Jim is frustrated. He's anxious about moving, and anxiousness translates into stress. And even though it's good stress, that is stress for someone with schizophrenia, but it's good stress for all of us. And I wouldn't trade places with you, Randy, for anything, because we have been there and I know how that feels. So I'm so sorry.
Oh, thank you. We learn. I've actually spoken to a lot of people in the last week who call for support. And they call for advice, but I'm not qualified to give advice. I can just say this is our experience. Remember, we're not therapists. We're bringing a couple on, we're bringing a therapist on and an advocate, her mom, on too. And they are going to be able to give advice. We just kind of tell it like it is. That's what we're here to do. So, but a person I spoke to this morning was just like, what do I do? What do I do? And I just said, find some joy. Find the joy. If it's a good day, enjoy the good day. You never want to dishonor a good day by not appreciating it. So I think I could give that advice. Mimi, how are you and Nick doing? You're muted.
I'm going to say the same thing I've said for the last, I think, many times, is nothing much has changed. It's all boring and the same, which translates in our lives to good.
Yes.
When it's boring. So, I mean, nothing's changed much one way or the other, but I am slowly working on things with him to try and get him more engaged in doing things. But all in all, everything is on a pretty even keel right now.
That's good. Thank you. And as we've discovered, ordinary is miraculous.
I remember throughout, long periods of time thinking, God, if I could just go back to being bored, you know what I mean? Of nothing happening, of things just being not even worth commenting on just for one day. So
Mm-hmm.
when it does come around, I do appreciate it.
Yep.
Boring means no stress, means good for people with
Right.
schizophrenia.
Yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely. And by the way, we are all, if you caught our episode with the Mad Moms and a strong advocacy movement to get the blood test requirements changed for a med that many of us have had success with called Clozaril. But there was good news today. Mindy, do you want to share what that is? And then we'll bring in our guests.
Yay, yay, yay. Whoopee, if we could only have things to rattle now, but there's celebration all over the country for people taking clozapine because the FDA that's had these barriers with required blood tests and all kinds of things that have to be done in order to take the drug, in order to get your clozapine, has been lifted. It is gone starting today. There will be education, and doctors will be encouraged during the phase-in period to still, especially then, do blood tests and here and there. But the barrier of no blood test, no pills, and some places, even with a blood test, they would get like 1 week supply and then be yanked around to get another week. It's just such a cause for celebration.
That is, and
It shows you what a bunch of angry moms can do when they get organized. I
Yes.
said to my friend who was one of the founders of the Angry Moms, I said to her today when she texted me, what are we going to do with ourselves now? Like, we'll come up with something.
there
there's
are other things to fight
plenty
for.
of
Yeah, we'll
things.
come
Yeah.
up with something.
Absolutely. So along these lines, many people have asked us for just actionable steps. So we figured we'd bring in a couple of experts to do that. We are bringing in, and guys, you can unmute and turn your cameras on as I introduce you. Clinical psychologist Dr. Michelle Sherman wrote a book about a year ago called "I'm Not Alone," and it was a guide for teenagers. If you're on YouTube, you see Mindy is holding it up, and it is for teens who have a parent with a serious mental illness or a history of trauma, I would say, or a history of trauma. And Michelle is a clinical psychologist who was the psychologist of the year from the American Psychologist Association in 2022, which is a big deal. And here with her is her mom, DeAnne Sherman. DeAnne and I share a love of theater. She is a choreographer. I am an actor and singer. And so we know the value of arts in many ways. She's also an advocate and a volunteer with NAMI, Minnesota. So there's a new book that has just come out in January. But it's not just for teens, although I imagine the teen guide would help us all. And here's Mindy holding it up. Loving someone with a mental illness or a history of trauma, skills, hope, and strength for your journey. And we could use all three of those. So welcome to both of you. I'm so
Thank
glad
you.
you're here. We have
We're
a lot
happy to
of
be here.
so glad to have you. We have a lot of questions, and without getting personal or naming names, I'm just wondering if there is a story behind why you wrote these books.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. This is such an esteemed podcast, and so it is truly an honor. We've had the good privilege of knowing Mindy for a couple years and have talked about this for a while, and so we are excited and honored. Yes, part of, as I think for many of us in this area, is a combination of professional and personal passion. For me, having worked with veterans and other individuals who experience mental illness and trauma for a lot of years, the passion for families began actually in the mid-1990s. I was working in VA hospitals and just aware of all the family members sitting in the waiting rooms when the veterans would go in for their 10-minute med checks or things like that. I'm like, there is such commonality of need among all these people who are sitting here together in the same room, but no one is supporting or helping them. So actually I got my very first like tiny $3,000 grant and started developing family education programs. It started from there. And so for the past 30 years, this has been really what I've dedicated my career to, is supporting families in which a veteran or a loved one has mental illness or some history of trauma. Furthermore, both Mom and I have a number of family members who experience different kinds of mental illnesses. And so our passion for this is not only an academic, a research, a clinical one, but we are equally lifted, motivated, and driven to continue this work due to the numerous people we care about who are really struggling as well. So the kind of funny, I think, hopefully sweet note is it was actually 20 years ago when I said to my mom, hey, you want to write a book? So we wrote our first 3 books just for teenagers in the mid 2000s. And then right before COVID, I said, hey, do you want to write another book? So we've written our 4th and kind of 5th ones here this past few months that's just come out. So it's been a lovely mother-daughter journey for 20 years.
Wow. And I will say I have something in common with DeAnne too, because I was a teacher in one of my other lives. And that is part of your story too, DeAnne. So could you tell us about how being a teacher made you aware of this need? And I will also say, before she answers, all of us who have written a book, Randy and Mimi and me, should have a mother like DeAnne, because she's a co-promoter of everything Michelle does, stands in for her if she can't make it, and they could finish each other's sentences. They're just such a team. But DeAnne, maybe you could also share about your education background and how that ties into your knowledge.
Well, my biggest educator are certainly families with lived experience, whether they're ours or others. And right up there along with them is my daughter, Michelle. So she has helped me learn a great deal about mental illness. My degree is in something else, not in psychology or mental health. But so she is my greatest teacher, and I have joined her with the same passion I have learned to understand and have a great passion for people who are loving someone with a mental illness or are dealing with a history of trauma. When we were writing our books, as an educator, Mindy, I brought kind of the layperson approach. I was reading it as if I were reading it to help myself. And does this need to be highlighted? Does this section need to be a call out box? What if we have some bullet points? What if we have a story right here? Or I will sometimes say, Michelle, I'm not quite sure what you're saying here, honey. I don't understand this. And my other daughter, Lisa, who has read all of our work, she will sometimes say, declinicalize it. It's too clinical. So then we'd go back to the drawing board. But I think I brought my background in education on how to present in a meaningful, hopefully respectful and easy to understand bits and pieces for our work. So being as a teacher, you know, Mindy, we always like to tell people things and help people understand things. So thanks.
Let's get down to some of what you've learned and some of what you can share today. The first thing, we'll get to the 4 C's in a minute, I think Mimi has that question, but when did you learn about anosognosia, the lack of insight that you're ill? When did you learn about that as a psychologist? And do you think enough people know about it?
Oh, it's a great question. And the answer is, I learned it from families. I learned it from NAMI. I learned it from Advocacy. I learned it from reading all of your books. I learned it from, you know, honestly, social media and people posting and learning about it. Obviously, I've been out of grad school a number of years, but even in talking to folks who have been recently in grad school, it's not talked about. It is not explained. People don't even know the word. They don't know the term. Mindy and I actually here in a couple months are going to give a talk for the Minnesota Psychological Association and say, hey, these are like the top 10 things you didn't learn in graduate school, and anosognosia is way up high on the list. So I know as a mental health professional who even specialized in this area for 30 years, I didn't hear about it until probably a decade ago. So it's a little embarrassing to admit, but it is the truth. And people in my circle still don't talk about it. Other mental health professionals have never heard of it, don't know what it is, but I can speak clinically without identifying any of my clients, sharing it with some family members. is so very helpful. Like, oh, they're not just being in denial or being stubborn or whatever else. It's like, it's part of the illness. So it has been incredibly helpful to talk about Amador's work, talk about some of his skills, and give that idea of actually what it is. Has been a game changer for understanding. And so I have the passion and the torch, like all of you, to continue to educate people. We actually just wrote something for the Nominee-Ramsey County website, a little 2-pager sort of information. So I'm joining the mission to try to raise awareness.
Okay,
Is
thank you.
there-
And it's just it's very interesting because as my son entered the sober house, I surreptitiously spoke to the house manager because I'm still co-conservator of his person, and we've agreed that my son is not going to know that I'm speaking to him. But I said, "Are you aware that he has schizophrenia?" And he's like, "Well, no, he didn't put that on the application." And I'm like, "Yeah, I wish he'd been honest about it," he said. And I said, just so you know, it's not about not being honest. He was completely honest. He does not believe he has this illness. It's something we have to fight all the time because my son was being honest. As far as he's concerned, he doesn't have a substance abuse problem and he doesn't have schizophrenia. He did have to admit to the substance abuse to get into the house. So whether or not he believed it, he had to put it on the application. But that's the kind of thing you fight all the time if you're not aware that anosognosia is a medical condition common with stroke and brain illnesses where they don't know they're ill. So that, oh, he wasn't honest was not true. He was just not aware. So anyway, thank you. Mimi.
You're muted. Oops.
I'd like to ask about the 4 C's, which is, as laid out by you, a way to respond to situations. So can you tell us about that?
I'd be happy to. That's exactly what it is. It's a 4-step process on how to respond to triggering situations in an intentional way rather than a reactionary way. And so there are 4 steps.
Like,
They
can
all
you
begin.
describe what a triggering situation might be? Can you, so if you love someone that has one of these illnesses, can you describe what a triggering situation is? And then that'll help us more with the story.
You're having an argument over perhaps taking medication, or you want to go, you set a time at 4 o'clock, you were going to leave, that person isn't ready at 4, it's 4:15, 4:20, they're not ready, you're really upset. Anything that kind of gets you riled up, you and your loved one just aren't communicating, and you find yourself getting really riled up about it. Michelle, do you want to add anything
No, that
to
was great,
those?
man. That was great.
Okay. And so there are 4 pieces: catch, calm, challenge, and choose compassion. So the first one is catch, and you catch yourself. You go, wow, I'm really sounding loud. I'm using words I don't usually use. I'm starting to perspire. I feel my heart rate come up. This is a situation I need to cut off right now and stop. Even do like a hand sign in your mind that says stop. And the second is calm. So you remove yourself from the situation and maybe do some deep breathing or some square breathing, go for a little walk. It doesn't need to be a long, involved process, or it could be a couple hours if you needed it to be, but just get yourself back down to a healthy place. And then you can do number 3, which is challenge. And this is tricky because you actually come to a point where you ask yourself, do I want to behave like this? Am I showing up in this situation in a way that is consistent with my core values of who I am as a person? And what's more important, being right or the relationship? So you kind of ask yourself those questions. And once you've dealt with that for a bit, you choose compassion. And so you go to your loved one, everyone's hopefully in a better place. And maybe you decide to do nothing really. And that's okay. It's not that you weren't hurt, you weren't offended, but you're not going to work on it right now. Maybe you'll use some humor. Maybe you'll decide to agree to disagree. But maybe you want to talk about it. And so you come with kindness in your voice, in your manner, in your face, and you give grace to yourself and to your loved one. And hopefully you can have a better conversation.
That is really hard to do. Since you've read all your books, you know that all of us have failed that test at various times. And I have to say, I have said to Jim, what the blank, when he's doing some of these things, at least I now see that I can compliment myself on one thing. I often knew I had to take a break and take a walk and just get away from him and do something else. So I can say I failed, but I did at least that part. So I think this is really helpful to, if you want.
Boy, can I relate to that too. When you first started talking, the first thing that came to mind was one time years and years ago, coming to Nick's apartment and finding it just overrun with cockroaches. I mean, to an extent that it was like a horror movie. And after, hours of, supposedly he was helping me, but I was running around like a lunatic with spray bombs and doing this and that, then just screaming at him and screaming at him. The big culmination of my screaming at him was, so this is how you handle a kitchen. This is how okay, this is it for you. No more food. And even as I said it, in the back of my mind, yeah, well, that's probably one you're going to have to back up off of a little bit. But it was like, that was it. That's what it came to. No more food for you. You get as crazy, excuse the expression, as the situation sometimes.
I'm so glad you shared that because, and I'm sure, Michelle, you've had clients that are saying the same thing, because there's two layers of problems, and we all face just having a loved one with a serious mental illness or history of trauma is a challenge in itself. And there's the problem, and then there's our reaction to the problem. And we can't often fix the problem, but what the 4Cs can do is help us not make it worse by being aware if we're compounding the problem. And I've actually done this. I have 3 grandchildren, they're first, second, third grade. And there was one time the 2 littles were in nursery school and I picked them up and they were just not having it. They were not getting in the car seat. They were not, we've all been there, right? They were just not listening. And I was going to give them a timeout, which we're not supposed to do with gentle parenting. But anyway, so what,
Oh, no, really?
No. Oh, please. But because it's my daughter's rules, they're her children. But what I said was, okay, it's time for a timeout and grandma's taking it. Grandma's going to have a timeout.
There you go.
That's what I did. So I said, all right, so don't get in your car seat. Just get in the car. I'm going to walk away and you can see me through the window and I'm going to come back when I'm calm. And so they saw me take a time out and I breathed and I said, do I want to add to this? What's going to happen? But without walking away, I would have gotten down that slippery slope of I want to be right. They have to listen to me. They should respect their elders, which is true. But at the moment, that wasn't going to help that. So it's similar to that. Anything you want to add, Michelle? Yeah.
Oh, I just
no, Mindy, go. Go, Mimi, go.
One of the things that has been said to me, a million times is, separate. It's the disease talking. It's not him talking. Separate the disease from the person, and it's good advice and it's helpful. But at the same time, I also liken it to, if your child had a disease that caused involuntary movements or something, and they involuntarily threw an arm and it smacked you across the face, well, you would understand why that arm went, but it still hurts. You still got smacked across the face. And see, that's the thing that I think is we as the loved ones have to develop tools for that, tools for learning how to, because it's like, it does still hurt. So we can't just say, oh, it's nothing.
Maybe I totally agree with you. And I think being able to recognize, and part of the second C of calming is taking care of ourselves. Like, oh, that is painful. That doesn't, what do I need right now? Okay. And part of why we wrote the 4 C's this way is trying to spread out the distance between the trigger, the stimulus, and the response. Like Viktor Frankl talks about, our ultimate power is the ability to choose, right? Between when something happens and how we respond. And so part of what we're trying to do is spread that out so I can be intentional rather than reactive and just, do I always yell or scream or swear or whatever else. And the other part, at the risk of sounding too much like a psychologist, which I guess I am, is that we're also infusing principles from an evidence-based psychotherapy called ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy. And a huge part of that is helping us check in with ourselves. Am I behaving in a way consistent with my values? Is this the kind of mom, wife, grandmother that I want to be? And if not, what do I need to choose to do differently? Because we humans are habitual. We do the same thing over and over. It's like, well, I'm having more space between the stimulus and the response, and I'm going to calm. I'm going to check in with myself. How do I really want to approach? And then approach with compassion and kindness. So yeah, it's easier said than done. Absolutely, Mindy. Couldn't agree with you more.
One thing I've wondered, since I've never, with the psychiatrist, let me spit this out here. With a psychiatrist, I always assume I, as a family member, am going to be included as long as Jim is okay with it, because it takes a team, as Dr. Laitman, Jim's doctor, says, to remember all those things. What are you supposed to take? What's changing? Reporting symptoms, and so forth. But when Jim has had psychologists, which he's had many and always as an adult, I have never had a role, and I've never been invited to have a role. I always have thought, and I've always assumed they think that too, because they don't seek me out. Is there a role for families when a family member is working with a psychologist? And then considering anosognosia, how does that work if they don't think they're sick and then they won't sign a release?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great, challenging question. So we'll buckle in for the next 3 hours. And but yeah, sadly, many mental health professionals broadly are really trained in an individual sort of model. Okay. And I'm more of a couple and family psychologist, so I take more of that system sort of model, and I'm always trying to engage families. Now, there is the issue that with individual therapy, your primary person you're trying to build trust with and alliance with is the person in front of you. And so it is up to them and their decision whether or not they want someone involved. And it can be tricky in terms of what are you going to say, what are you not going to say, and all this sort of stuff. So the ultimate and most important thing is helping the individual in front of you feel empowered. Yet for me, for both assessment and helping with treatment goals, getting someone else engaged, whoever it may be, a teenager, a grandparent, a partner, a parent, can be invaluable. And so it's actually my norm that I try to do that, not necessarily for ongoing, every week sort of thing, because we're working on specific things, but to at least make the invitation. Now, family members may not always come, which can also be telling, and it is ultimately up to the individual patient and their decision. Unless, of course, there's risks of violence and suicidality and things of that nature. But it's tricky. And I'll tell you, I'm not the norm in this situation, because it is tricky. And again, many people have this individual sort of model, but I really am more holistic in my conceptualization and desire to include other people who are certainly being very impacted and can be helpful with helping the person I am serving with moving toward their goals, improving their quality of life, helping them in their relationships. Because what do we know? What does the Surgeon General say? What does the research say? Loneliness, disconnection, shame, stigma are huge, and they often get enacted in relationship. So if we can help our individual person have more fulfilling, have broader, have better connections and things with others in their lives, what a positive intervention that is. So
Yeah.
I'm a real fan, but I'd say it's not the norm.
In fact, I was just going to say, be careful, because now everyone in the country is going to call you because you sound like this amazing therapist.
So, and no wonder she got the award for the best family psychologist.
I want to speak for a moment to the people who can't get an appointment with a therapist, don't have someone like you on their team. So I actually have two-part question. One is kind of piggybacking on Mindy's question, which is, do you have tips for families for navigating around HIPAA, which is often misunderstood? So that's a tip thing. And the second thing is because we talked about the 4 C's, catch, calm. If we're the problem, we know how to fix that.
Right.
What do you tell, I hope in your book and in your practice, I'm sure you do, about setting boundaries in your own home and boundaries with your relationship with your loved one that can keep you safe and keep you sane, because clear boundaries are hard to set and hard to enforce, but I think they're important. So, those are two things I'd love to hear about. The first,
Yeah.
let's talk about HIPAA first.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's great. And I love both of those questions. Thank you. I believe the intent of these federal laws was to help protect people's privacy. And so I think that there is the rationale for some of that does make some sense. However, people need to feel safe being able to confide in their provider, whoever that is, that all makes sense. However, many families I talk to find it an incredible burden, and many mental health professionals don't understand it either. And so the message that I give very loud and clear, certainly in our book and more generally with couples and families, is you have the right, the ability to give as much information as you want to. You can send them a letter. You can do my chart, although your love wouldn't be able to read it, so that's a little tricky in terms of the e-record. You can drop off, a letter sort of thing. You can call, you can leave voicemails. You have the ability. There's nothing that says you cannot give your information. Now, the mental health provider may very well not come back and say, oh, so I know that you are you're someone's mom, you're Ben's mom, and and I saw him yesterday, he's doing well. If they don't have a release, and outside of an emergency, of course, shouldn't do that. But you can give as much information as you want to. Certainly during some times of crisis, there's often a reduction of these sorts of limits, and that can be a good time to encourage your loved one to sign a release. And third, and kind of a workaround that I often encourage people to think about, is if, say, Mindy is talking to Jim's psychiatrist and Jim hasn't signed the annual release, just say, Dr. X, I understand you can't tell me, what to do in this sort of situation, so with Jim, but how do you handle this in general? Can you give me some tips for how families can cope with this sort of stuff? Now, it's a little bit of a workaround, but it can be a way to get some information. The final comment I'll make about that, and it's just the reality. I hope we can be honest on this show. It's just the truth. Not all mental health professionals are going to take the time to call back, to spend the time to listen, to form a relationship. And it's very sad, because clearly we all share the passion that families are essential for both gathering information, helping with a treatment plan. I mean, you're the ones with them 24/7. I mean, oftentimes. The families are incredibly important. But what you hear sometimes mental health professionals say is, I don't have time for them. They keep calling me. They keep bugging me. I mean, you hear pushback on that end, just to be honest, right? And so I coach families in ways of how you can be helpful in terms of advocating for your loved one, such as, don't write a 20-page letter. They're not going to read it. How can you do the bullets? How can you give the most information? Keep an updated list, since often people go to different healthcare systems, of what medications they're on. That they've tried this medication in the past, it didn't work. They went to this residential treatment, blah, blah, blah. But the more you can be advocate and organized, I know some people use a binder sort of stuff to have it all together, but you can advocate and realize that they are probably very busy and under lots of pressures and scrutiny to see as many patients as they can in a short period of time, which is a systems problem, granted, but trying to appreciate that they're trying to help you. And frankly, if they're not, maybe it's time to try to find a different provider, one who will work and embrace and respect and collaborate with families, because families are everything, and they're so needed and can be so valuable.
Thank you, DeAnne. Anything to add, DeAnne, to that before we talk about boundaries?
No, great job, Michelle. Thank you.
What a good mom.
Job of covering that.
I will just like to add in here, the problem is when Jim has a psychologist who does not include families, he's the only one who can switch. The family cannot switch. So you're and then if the psychologist doesn't want to see the family, they have first crack at your child, and they can definitely influence them to not want to include the family. So we have nowhere to go, I don't think. But Jim doesn't see any more psychologists. He saw so many. Some of them were absolutely wonderful, and he couldn't wait to get there, and they helped him. but I have to say, I never quite knew what they did because I never once got invited. And so if he ever needs another one, I shall be steering him to Michelle if I can.
It's really sad because I think it's partly lack of understanding in our individual training model. We need to have a more holistic, a family system sort of perspective of understanding. It's like even with the child, I'm not comparing people with mental illness to children, but just listen to the metaphor for a second. If we have a child who goes in inpatient psychiatric unit and then they get discharged, but nothing in the family system has changed, the likelihood of the child maintaining the gains is very, very little. It's the same thing. If we're not intervening at the family level to assess, to support and things, the ability to help with the treatment plan and things like that is more limited. Now, there may be things that your loved one does not want to talk to you in front of and things like that, and fine, let them talk to their therapist about that sorts of things.
Right. I'm going to add one thing too that is sad and true, and families may need to know this. If your loved one has schizophrenia, they may have an alternate reality that is very true to them.
Yeah.
And they may have created a childhood that is not true.
Yeah.
They may tell a therapist that you abused them. They may tell a therapist that you are the devil. They may tell a therapist anything. And again, they may be lying or they may be telling what is their truth. So that if a therapist is listening and doesn't have the family involved, they get this skewed perception that this child has made up this theory that he's been through trauma when he hasn't, or she has been through trauma when she hasn't really been through trauma other than this horrible illness. So that can be an issue as well. When you're thinking about the family, know that don't believe everything that somebody with schizophrenia tells you, even if they pass a lie detector test, and that's theoretical because it's true to them. My son was being honest when he told the people in the sober house he doesn't have a diagnosis because to him it's true. So
great point. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Anything
about can you tell us about setting boundaries so that we can keep our sanity?
Oh, it's huge. And again, we do have actually our longest chapter in the book is all about setting boundaries because it's so hard, but it's so essential. I mean, first of all, we talk about what happens when we don't. When we let them do all these sorts of things, that we grow our resentment and our frustration and we become depressed or anxious. We become less interested in wanting to help them. It doesn't help our relationship. And so super important to be able to do that such that we can have an honest relationship and really wanting to be able to show up with you in an important and truthful way. At the same time, it's hard because we can be afraid that if I set this limit, what if they get angry? What if they leave? What if they stop their medication? What if they call the police? What if whatever? I mean, the risk is real and they may react in a really angry, attacking sort of way. And so it's risky. And so I think it's important for family members to figure out what is worth it and what's not. That whole pick your battle sort of idea of what really do I want to say, this is simply not okay. And then find a way to communicate that respectfully. And as you said, Randy, to be consistent with it. Because if some days it's okay if you have marijuana in the house, some days it's not, they're going to be like, well, what really is the boundary here? If I not only think about boundaries with them, but boundaries for myself, that I need to go to my yoga class every Monday night. I need to go to my church meeting on Sunday mornings or whatever it may be. And even if I'm feeling kind of guilty for doing so, because gosh, my husband is at home on the couch and my son is really in a bad place today, even more important that I need to do this for me so I can then come home somewhat fulfilled and lifted to be able to be present and supportive to my loved one. But setting those boundaries can evoke guilt and be uncomfortable, but is so important for this marathon that we're talking about rather than the short-term sprint.
Yeah. So, you're talking self-care and so on. And I will tell you, so many of our listeners are dealing with, can I make them take their meds if they live with me? And to me, that's a boundary. No, no meds, no money, no meds, no bed. I mean, that worked for 9 years until it didn't.
Yeah.
And boundaries are hard, but I think it's an important part, and I'm glad you have a full chapter.
It's incredible. It's assertiveness, right? It's all about how we do it, how we approach, how we then stay consistent with those such that we're teaching them, yeah, this is the case. And if you choose not to do this, that's okay, but this is going to be the consequence and we're going to follow through on
Yeah.
this.
So say more about that. How do you set boundaries so it works more of the time?
Yeah.
Tips. We need tips.
Right. Yes. Part of it is realizing that it is up to them whether or not and how they choose to respond to it. So going in and saying, I'm doing this for me. I don't have control over what they do, what they're not going to do, but I'm going to show up and set this limit because this is important to me. I've made this decision that it is not okay with me if, again, don't take their medications or drink excessively and things like that while living in my house. And so a person say at a calm time, okay, not in an angry, judgmental sort of way, but in a calm way. I just, it is so important for us to have continue to have a good relationship. And part of that for me involves wanting to be honest with you about what feels okay and what's not okay. And I am here and as your mom in so many ways of wanting to support and affirm and show you my unending love and desire to be present for you. And when you make some choices that are not okay, I need to set some limits and boundaries with that. And so I need to let you know that if you choose to do X, Y, and Z, it's not going to be okay for you to continue to live here. And I'll help you find a place, but if by such and so a time, if that's the choice that you're going to make. But if you hear what I'm doing, I'm really leaning into the word of choice, I'm leaning into the relationship, and I'm leaning into I still love you and I'm going to be here for you. It's not like, get out of here by tomorrow if you're not doing this. So it's, as Emitter talks a lot about, it's like the most important thing is a relationship, right? We're leaning into relationship, yet simultaneously, I need to take care of myself because otherwise I'm going to get burned out and it's not going to be what I actually hope is helpful for you.
One
Okay,
thing
thank
I
you.
want
Yeah,
to
yeah,
mention.
and then I think DeAnne looks like she wants to speak as well. So
Oh,
maybe
okay.
go ahead.
Okay.
You mentioned, Randy, you touched on self-care. And when you talk about boundaries, the first thing I think about is setting boundaries so that people who have a loved one managing a mental illness can take care of themselves. And Michelle used the word guilty. I'm not the one with the illness. I don't need to have that book club meeting once a month or my church study group. And what Michelle and I are trying to do with our books is just move the needle a few degrees and hope that our readers can be open and open up their perspective to the fact that it is essential that they take care of themselves. It's a non-negotiable. It's something they really have to do, and they can look forward to that Wednesday night dinner with a friend or walk, 2 times in the morning. And we all deserve um, we all deserve to have a life that it is full and rich and creative and joyful as we can be, and spiritually, emotionally, physically active to whatever extent we can. And if that happens, we're going to be better for everyone in our world, including our loved one who's managing a mental illness. And good caretaking isn't a week in the Bahamas, although we'd all love that right now. But maybe it's just 5 minutes to go into your bedroom and close the door, turn off the lights and breathe, do the square breathing, your mantra. You might want to repeat your mantra or cry or scream or whatever works for you. Maybe it's a walk around some of the beautiful green spaces, Mindy, that we have here in Minnesota, and get outside in nature. Maybe it's going to the theater, Randy, taking a trip to New York and watching the newest version of a play. So that self-care is just so essential, and it can be a game changer. And I just want to tell all of our listeners and our readers that you deserve every lovely, wonderful thing that you can pack into your life, because you are a beautiful person that deserves that. And you just go for it.
Thank you. Mindy and
Randy, I
then
see we're
Mimi.
running a little short of time and or getting down to our time.
Yeah,
And
we have 5
would-
minutes. So go
So
ahead.
I'd love it if one or the other you would talk a little bit about the book for teens.
Sure, yeah, you bet. Thank you for the request. We are equally passionate about supporting teenagers who are so often invisible in the family system when everyone is so focused and thinking about the individual with a mental illness. And it could be grandchildren, it could be biological or adopted children. But we know from both nature and nurture that they are at higher risk for having emotional health problems themselves. And so for literally 20 years, we've been really invested in thinking about how can we increase awareness, identification, and providing early intervention. Sadly, again, this is an opinion statement, it's not an area that NAMI has really embraced very much. We've actually tried for a number of years. There's been a Daughters and Son Coalition and things, and it's not really taken off. It's not an angle that they're really invested in. I'm actually going in 2 weeks to London, and I go meet with someone who coordinates the CEO of an organization called Our Time, that is all about supporting children whose parents have mental illness. They do in-school things, they do family exercise workshops and things, and so perhaps might bring some of those ideas back. But we wrote this book, I'm Not Alone, A Teen's Guide to Living with a Parent Who Has a Mental Illness or History of Trauma, to help these young people feel seen, to realize that they really aren't alone, to normalize some of their feelings, and most importantly, to also offer some tools for resilience. Because there is some research showing that if they can learn some skills and do some specific things, be it from diet, exercise, enough sleep, limiting substances, things like that. Some research is showing that it actually may decrease the risk of developing and the severity of their own mental health problems. So there's great reason to be hopeful, but we're not doing a lot of that in this country with regard to early intervention. And so often these kids fall in the cracks.
Right.
So that's really the reason we wrote that, and the hope to raise awareness.
Thank you.
I
And
have to say about both of your books, having read them, DeAnne must have had good influence with wanting it to be in plain English with more bullets. And then you, Michelle, are talking about families that want to give input to psychologists or psychiatrists to be short and snappy and get your message across without going on and on and on. That is exactly what these books are like. So I would strongly encourage people for either one to take a look. There are workbooks too, especially for the teenagers, but also for adults. You can write in there. There's exercises to practice what the chapter is about, to think about how it applies to you. I just think the format is anything but a textbook, but incredibly helpful.
Thank you, Mindy. Gosh, we'll pay it afterwards, okay?
Well, it sounds as though even anybody, let's say, who's a teacher in high school who wanted to create a support group for teens,
Yes,
that they could use this workbook as a
absolutely.
guide.
It's a
Because what
curriculum.
I'm hearing is, don't sweep it under the rug.
Absolutely. We need to raise awareness.
So many teens are like, well, I guess this is what parents do. Like, we all live in our own homes and we think this is the norm, but having a parent with a serious mental illness or a substance abuse problem, sweeping it under the rug, unexpressed trauma is the worst. So so we have a couple of minutes. I just want to ask if either one of you, has something to share that we haven't asked you about that you'd most like people to know. And also, and then we'll ask how we can get in touch with you and recap the names of the books.
Awesome. Well, thank you. It has just honestly been a real privilege and delight and honor to be with all of you. And I think a huge part of, probably the mission of the podcast is continuing to help people feel not alone. Because you hear, I'm sure as do I, all the time, people feeling, oh, if only I had this podcast to listen to, or this support group, or things like that, which is frankly part of why we wrote the books. Because some people will never listen to a podcast. They'll never go to a support group. They'll never go to a NAMI or a first episode program. But maybe they would pick up a book. Maybe they'll listen to a podcast. And so I am hopeful that continuing to reach out to families in different ways to let people know that they truly aren't alone, that there are skills that they can learn, and which is what both of our books are, is research-based skills to help people that have learned from families over 30 years of doing this work, that try to put them into a format that can be digestible and learned. And so hopefully people can take from our work the message of that they are not alone, that there are skills available, and there are resources available if they want to connect, again, through NAMI or other organizations like this. So the last thing I will just say is it's been really fun working with my mom. And we say 99% of the time we've had a great experience. It's been super fun when we needed to take a break because we try to practice what we preach with the self-care. We do like some online shopping for clothes, or we play with my puppy or things like that, that we try to make it a pleasant experience, but it's been a blessing and a privilege collaborating with her.
Thank you. DeAnne?
Oh, thank you, sweetheart. I couldn't agree more. And we realize this. We often talk about the blessing and the privilege that we have. We work so well together, which isn't necessarily always the case. I have one quick tip that I wish I had known when I was raising my children, and it's about communication. When your child or your loved one comes to you with a situation, a problem, three things you can do. You say, would you like me to listen? Would you like my opinion? Or would you like my help? And when my girls were younger, I went straight to the help. Okay, what can we do about this? How can we fix it? Let's just make this okay. I didn't know about those other two steps. Would you like me to listen? Would you like my opinion? Or would you like me to help? I think that's just a great thing to know. And thanks for letting me say that.
I love that. I actually use that now with my granddaughter, the listening part. She just wants to talk, and she likes it that grandma listens. Her mom is always rushing around to try to help. And that's how I was too. But grandmahood, I'm getting a second chance.
It's amazing. It's amazing being a grandparent, isn't it, Mindy? Yeah.
As long as you take a time out when you need it, I say. So I want to thank you both so much for joining us. The teen book is called I'm Not Alone, a teen guide if your parents have a mental illness or history of trauma. And that's a fairly new book as well. It's 2024, I think. But the newest one is Loving Someone with Mental Illness or a History of Trauma, Skills, Hope, and Strength for Your Journey. All of them are available on Amazon. And we will put further links for information in our show notes. And hang in there. You're not alone.
Amen. And I would just like to say there are also some other free resources available on our website. So I've created some other things during my years of work, and many of them are free. So
okay, share your website if you would.
www.seedsofhopebooks.com. Seedsofhopebooks.com. Just go to the resource tab, and there are all sorts of international, national resources, things I've made, things other people have made. So in addition to our books, I'd just like to point out the free resources as well.
Fantastic. And many of the things we've spoken about today, we have episodes with Dr. Amador on them. You can listen to that. Should My Loved One Live With Us? We have an episode on that. SSDI, getting help. What's going to happen when we die? We have a couple of episodes where we interviewed people whose parents have mental illness, and we have other ones coming up. So, go for the free resources. Go to NAMI Family to Family. Go to the other episodes of our podcast. You're not alone, and we're all here to help. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
It's been just a pleasure.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Schizophrenia, 3 Moms in the Trenches. You can help out the podcast and help others by sharing the podcast and by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts and or on YouTube. And remember, you can reach us at mindygreiling.com, randyk.com, or miriam-feldman.com.